Good day, everyone. My name is Ebimbori Seifa, and this is West Africa and the World. This is a platform where we explore crucial events happening across the different sectors in West Africa. In addition, we examine global events and their implication for West Africa. For today's conversation, which is a two-part series, we're going to focus on the blue economy. Today, we talk about coastal West Africa. Next episode, we focus on inland or landlocked West Africa. Now, every time we reflect on blue economy in West Africa, in coastal West Africa to be precise, the conversation is dominated by diverse narratives. For instance, we talk about environmental security, or the issue of climate change, or the challenge of illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. These are all serious concerns linked to the core objective, or one of the core objectives of the African Union. When we reflect on the African Union Blue Strategy, which was ratified in 2019, in addition to the African Union African Agenda for 2063, a huge chunk of this document or this initiative is focused on the blue economy. The end goal is to create 57 million jobs by 2030 and have a revenue of $400 billion US. This is very, very important. We cannot ignore the implication of having a thriving blue economy on household and livelihood and the overall economic stability of West Africa. But when we think about blue economy in our conversation, we are looking at blue economy as a geostrategic frontier for sustainable development. We think about the issue of access, the issue of control, the issue of influence over territorial waters. But before we delve into the conversation itself, a quick reminder for you to subscribe, like, repost, share, drop your comments, and don't forget to recommend topics for future discussions. Now, let us establish some statistics to build the context of our conversation. Coastal West Africa is approximately 7,000 kilometers from Nigeria down to Mauritania. In addition to that as well, 40% of illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing occurs in West Africa. According to the African Union report as of 2025, the West African sub-region is losing $2.3 billion US in illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, and this has serious implications for our economy. The Gulf of Guinea, which is part of coastal West Africa, when it comes to offshore oil and gas installation, is estimated at over $10 billion annually. And that is a lot. And that also speaks to the issue of control and access and influence. That also speaks to the issue of different foreign interests within our subcontinent. Nigeria, which is the largest and the most populous country in West Africa with the longest coastline, has an untapped estimated blue economy revenue of $296 billion. So we can see how relevant the blue economy is to sustainable development. And we can also see the attraction of West Africa's blue economy for foreign powers. Now, a quick detour into the history of West Africa's blue economy from our discussion, from the context of our conversation. We look at pre-colonial West Africa. Now, pre-colonial West Africa had a thriving, rich, and diverse blue economy. We had great kingdoms controlling or leveraging on those marine resources. The Benin Kingdom, the Dahomey Kingdom, the Oyo Empire, the Ashanti Kingdom, the Efik Kingdom. Each and all of these kingdoms, these are the major ones, had control over trade routes. For instance, when it comes to the resources generated from our territorial waters, they leveraged on seafood, sea plant for medicinal purpose, and also salt. All these resources were processed, value-added, and sold to inland West African empires or kingdoms, and sometimes beyond the subcontinent, all the way to Central Africa. We also had a transatlantic trade. By the 15th century, the Portuguese were the first European, according to record, that landed on the shores of coastal West Africa. And so international relations began, trade relations, if we want to focus on that, or some form of blue diplomacy. These kingdoms were known to have leveraged their trade relations with Europeans to also promote or further their interests within inland West Africa, or to co-opt or expand their empire influence across inland West Africa and central West Africa as well. That also led to also a factory or industry of canoe and boat making, as well as sea fishing implements. These are all very important aspects of our blue economy in pre-colonial Africa. By colonial West Africa, there were some changes. In addition to all these international relations, trade, expansion of empire, and factory, we also had the control this time around of our blue economy by the Europeans. We had the presence of France, Britain, and Portugal, amongst other countries, controlling the blue economy, controlling the trade routes, controlling the resources. We had industrialization as well, in terms of fish factories, just developed enough to ensure that raw materials were sent down to the ports through railways constructed and then shipped out of West Africa to other parts of the world. A very tragic part of our blue economy history past is the transatlantic slave trade, where Africans were enslaved and forcefully migrated out of West Africa into other parts of the world to strengthen their economies. By the end of the First and the Second World War, the economy in Europe was unstable. And so there was a realization that in order to build the economies of Europe, it was important to invest just a little bit more into the economies of West Africa. And so we saw the construction of more sophisticated ports. We saw shipping companies being set up, established. We also saw transportation hubs and logistics, as well as insurance, all tied to port activities, but again, still heavily controlled by European powers. Crude oil was also discovered, and natural gas. And then we also had exploitation of these resources. Now, these are very, very important, because by this time, West African states had little or no control over these resources. It was controlled by European power. They had access to all these resources and decided where goods were sent to or what goods were brought in. Now, when it comes to import and exports in West Africa, 90% of every import and export that occurs within West Africa happens through shipping or through the ports. So that now takes us to post-colonial West Africa. By this time, the end of colonization meant that African states had some form of control or 100% control over its resources, political, economic control, in this case, blue economic control. And yes, we did. Ports were constructed by state governments and controlled by state governments. Custom duties and tax were dictated by state governments. Legislation and rules and guidelines for fishing in our economic exclusive zones were also dictated as well. And so we had some form of control. But years passed, and in the last 10 years, we have seen some changes. We have seen intervention. We have seen control and ownership by foreign entities. Let's focus on ports first. Now, ports are very important logistics nodes that has geostrategic importance for economic development and sustainability across countries in coastal West Africa. In the last few years, we have noticed that China has been involved in the construction of ports across the continent. This is part of China's Belt and Road initiatives. It talks about a win-win partnership with countries across Africa. Now, where coastal West Africa is concerned, we have 35 ports at different levels of construction where China is involved in. In the case of the Lekki Deep Sea ports, China has 75% ownership and has a financial investment of 54% in terms of financing of the construction of this particular port. What this means is that China gains financially from every trade transaction that occurs in our ports, in this Lekki Deep Sea port. It also means that China gets to control access and decide to a certain degree what kind of goods will come into Nigeria as well as other countries in West Africa, because it has control over the ports. It has a 16-year operating lease, and that is good for China. definitely good for China. And so we have this ripple effect because we notice that we have a lot of Chinese goods in our markets across the subcontinent, competing heavily, unfairly if I may say, with local manufacturers with the attendant governance deficit issues. But that is one aspect of our ports. Let us now look at within West Africa. A few years ago, we had a series of coups that led to the breakout of Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali from ECOWAS. What we saw was the rollout of sanctions, and one of those sanctions was limited access to seaports. Now you see, these three countries are landlocked countries, and they rely on having access to the seaport, in particular Abidjan seaports. And that was quite important for its access to goods and services. Recall that the West African region consumes more than it produces, whether it's heavy machinery, equipment, fertilizers, or consumer goods. And this had serious implications for these three countries. The idea was that through these sanctions, these three countries would come back to ECOWAS. And Abidjan was happy to comply. But Togo saw an opportunity and decided to leave its ports open. And Togo became the lifeline for access to seaports for these three countries. Now for Togo argues that mediation, cooperation, and the opening of its seaport are means of diplomacy between these three states and ECOWAS, and perhaps a way to bring these three states back to the fold of ECOWAS to enhance economic integration. Those are laudable points or objectives where Togo is concerned. But the reality is that Togo saw an economic advantage, an opportunity, because seaports are very, very important. It opens up different areas of enterprise, trucking, warehouse, insurance, shipping, imports, exportation, custom duties and revenue. So currently now in West Africa, we have the Lomé bloc and the Abidjan bloc all competing, or rather we call it the war of the ports. Going on now is all about the blue economy and how much revenue that we can generate from it. Further afield as well, coming back to China's influence on our seaports. This is very, very important because not too long ago, China developed a seaport in Djibouti. It was meant to be commercial, but it has a dual purpose, both commercial and military. And now China has got a naval base right there in Djibouti. The Lekki deep sea port has a dual purpose, a commercial port and a military port. So far so good. West Africa has vehemently resisted foreign bases, coastal West Africa in particular, on their soil. Now we have a seaport that has dual purposes with a 70% ownership by China. Who knows, in the next few decades or years, we might have a Chinese naval base in coastal West Africa. And what does that mean for West Africa? Because the Atlantic Ocean, the United States is one of our nearest neighbors, east coast of the United States. Yes, there are a few islands between coastal West Africa and the east coast part of the United States, but none of them has actually been seen as viable for a military base by the United States. The US has a series of treaties or agreements with countries in the Middle East as well as Europe. What happens if there's a crisis there and there's a need for a quick deployment of troops traveling by sea from East Coast US down to the Mediterranean or to the Middle East? What happens if China decides that deployment is not in its interest and then tries to block or forestall? Because do not forget that 35 ports have different levels of ownership by China, and that deals with access and control. So these are critical issues that we cannot ignore. And of course, European Union is not left out in terms of the interest in our coastal water. Don't forget that during colonial era, they had influence over our waters and the resources underneath the waters, be it oil and gas, or be it trade routes, or be it ports and shipping activities. These were all crucial. And at one point, West Africa coastal waters was heavily militarized. That was due to the prevalence of piracy in our waters, and that opened up the room for partnerships between coastal West African countries and European countries who saw this trade route as a means of sending in their goods for consumers. manufactured goods into West Africa. But piracy has declined, and so has the militarization of our coastal water declined as well. And so recently, last year, we had Europe investing 12 billion euros into parts of Central and West Africa, into our ports. And the argument was to standardize safety, security, and performance. Those are valid points, because coastal West African heads of state are the very first people to tell you that our ports need to be efficient. They need to work effectively to ensure sustainable economic activities. But that 12 billion euros is not just about efficiency, security, or safety. It's about access to our ports, to our resources in our waters. Because China has a goal to expand its influence, and that is through the Belt and Road initiatives. It has been busy constructing railways and roads and seaports, and Europe is very much aware of its declining influence in this region. And so we have these three giants. We have the US, we have China, we have Europe, all competing or all aware of the geostrategic importance of our waterways, of our blue economy. So that is one aspect. In as much as I don't want to talk about illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, this is still a huge part of the blue economy, because the seafood industry is not just about livelihoods in terms of domestic livelihoods. It's also about income generation for the coastal West African countries. Countries like Ghana and Senegal have rolled out different initiatives on how to protect local fishers from unfair competition with foreign fishers. But this has not necessarily been effective on ground, because we still have this conflict between the local fishers and the foreign fishers. A lot of the foreign fishers do not adhere to the regulations guiding fishing within our economic exclusive zones. China, for instance, has been labeled as one of the main violators of these shipping rules and regulation. China has adopted the distance water fishing as a means of ensuring the sustainable fishing within its own territorial water. So it's looking to fish in distant waters. Now, there is nothing wrong in having foreign fleets coming in to fish in your territorial waters, as long as they abide by the set rules and regulations. And I'm sure you are wondering, why are coastal West African heads of state silent about this unfair competition between local fishers and foreign fishers, who in some cases are heavily subsidized by their own government as well? Well, the answer lies in the loans and the development and infrastructure investments by China in coastal West Africa. So how do you speak against China when you've collected so much money from them regarding loans and infrastructure development? Now we come back again to two major players, China and the United States. And we look at it from the perspective, again, of seaports, because I still keep coming back to seaports. This is one part of our blue economy that we need to discuss and explore and reflect on, because seaports are relevant for economic growth. So there are three things that we need to reflect on before we wrap up our conversation for today. The first one is the militarization of our waters. Unfortunately, coastal West Africa has been dealing with a lot of land-based conflicts, and so a huge chunk of our defense budget has been diverted or invested in our air force and our land forces, with little left for our naval forces. Now that we have a lot of ports in West Africa, constructed or invested or partly owned by China, and some of them have dual purposes, the possibility of having a Chinese naval base in coastal West Africa is higher. Would the United States ignore that? That is something that we need to see for the future. So what happens to West Africa when our territorial waters or our economic exclusive zone becomes a point of geostrategic contestation between the United States and China? And then the last question, have coastal West African governments ceded their marine blue economy, sovereignty to China. These are critical issues that I would like us to reflect on. My name is Ebimbori Seifa, and this is West Africa and the World. Thank you for listening to my thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe, share, and drop your comments. Thank you. Bye.